though I don't have cards yet, I know the gentleman had a question, so let me ask you to give your question, and then I'll ask people to pick up, speak loudly, and I'll try to repeat it for the benefit of the tape.
Injustice thrives where isolation reigns. The question is, how do you counsel individuals or organizations to overcome this myth or even the reality of isolation? And
Okay.
because if we attempt to deal with the question that you're dealing with, then we're at some point isolated.
Okay. So the point was that injustice deals in isolation, and how do you counsel individuals and groups to engage in efforts to overcome that? Robert, do you want to start? Or whoever wants to start can.
Well, if it's okay, I'll take one quick start, just because I think that part of my interest in the struggle of Romani people, of the Roma, is very much an effort to kind of deal with that tendency toward isolation. There are disfavored people all over the world. And whether they are disfavored because of their race, because of their religion, because of their gender, because of their status, their ethnicity, the dynamics of injustice have a lot in common. And there is, I think, great power, great strength when we recognize that those dynamics have to be resisted no matter where they are, and no matter what the context, no matter what the political environment, that we have to make that absolute commitment to rejecting discrimination and bias, rejecting injustice. And I think it becomes an issue for everybody because ultimately, I believe, you judge the civility of a society, you judge the character of society, not by how you treat the rich and the privileged and the respected and the celebrated. You judge the society by how you treat the poor, the hated, the condemned, the disfavored. People coming to Alabama can't spend time in the big buildings of Birmingham or Montgomery or Mobile and say this is what Alabama is. If you really want to understand the character of Alabama, you've got to go to the jails and prisons. You've got to go to death row. You've got to go to the black belt. You've got to go to the places where people are struggling, because it's our willingness to deal with all of that that ultimately reveals what I think is most critical to who we are. And if we stand up and we try to protect the poor and the condemned and the imprisoned, we say that their rights are valid, their needs are legitimate, we see their rights as valuable as the rich and the powerful, then we emerge, then we evolve. But until we do that, I don't think any of us can isolate ourselves just because we can create a day-to-day that's a little more comfortable than somebody else and claim that our society is good. Our day may be good, our life may be good, but our society is not. And that's why I think your question is so incredibly important in dealing with these dynamics of who we are, all of us.
Robert and Isabela, I'm going to ask you to respond to that question, but I'm also going to go ahead and put the other question from the audience on the table, and maybe you can respond there also. And the question is, how does the ERRC engage the Roma communities, and individuals in its efforts? So if you could respond to the first question and also incorporate this question in your answer.
Sure. Well, I just, do you want to?
The second one.
Okay. On the question of injustice and isolation, I mean, I think it's a complex issue. I think isolation in Roma communities at times breeds injustice because it creates and it reinforces this sense of the other and of people who are outside of the mainstream of society and therefore in some ways not deserving of justice. At the same time as a report that Isabela cited earlier made note of, that they had some interesting results on some of the perceptions of Roma in Bulgaria on the question of justice, and it seemed that some Roma living in more isolated rural communities in Bulgaria were reporting less less in the way of discrimination and adverse interaction with the majority population, and the authors of the study surmise that that's simply because they have no interaction with the majority population at all, simply none. But I think even in that case, that kind of isolation cannot be an excuse for allowing injustice to continue and allowing socioeconomic conditions in rural communities that rival anything that you would find in the Kibera slums in Nairobi, Kenya. So it's a kind of a two-edged sword in the case of Roma in Eastern Europe.
Isabela?
Yes, just to echo, and I thank you, Bryan, for what you said. Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. You can't really treat things in isolation. And I used to say the same thing, that the level of discrimination Roma face kind of reflects on the way society is, and how tolerant is towards each other, and that we have to work together towards a common purpose, because it's not just as Czechs would say, our Roma are better than your Roma to the Slovaks. We are a society together, and we have to deal together with this, no matter who we are. To the second question, how we involve Roma communities in our work, that's a very good question. And we're always trying to challenge ourselves to the extent that we improve the way we try to involve Roma in the organization. And I'm proud to say that I'm one of the examples, because I just joined the organization less than 1 month ago, just because of the need that the work of the organization stems from within, that it actually reflects on the opinions and thoughts of the community itself. But beyond that, we actually, the whole work we do is informed by the work of the Roma individuals and Roma NGOs, that we have them as partners in our work. And we do that through local monitors. We do that through engaging them in human rights training. And I just came recently from a human rights training in Turkey, where it was so refreshing to see Roma students being so interested in human rights work for their community in a country where the human rights discourse it's so light, it's not so consistent. Nonetheless, the young Roma understood how important it is for them to make a change for their community and to be engaged beyond their own interest. And this is one example of how we get involved with the community. And it's obviously it's a mutual approach. It's things we do to come to them and to reach out through the people, Roma people that we have in the organization. And it's also the other way around. They signal to us cases of human rights violation, and we try to respond very promptly through legal representation, through training, through broader counseling, and through giving them the opportunity, for instance, to speak out for themselves in different forums that we try to facilitate, like conferences or seminars. And obviously, we take at the core of our work the issues that Romani women are facing throughout Europe because of the level of multiple discrimination that they're facing. We think that it should be at the core of everything we do, and we are very happy that within the organization we also have a women's rights officer that is trying to work very closely with Romani women's organizations and individuals to bring that together in a so-called Roma women's movement that we are trying to establish.
I think Robert wanted to make a brief comment.
Yeah, it's interesting because the issue of how we engage with the Roma community and isolation are linked in a very notable case that the European Roma Rights Center took before the European Court of Human Rights on the issue of school segregation, the DH case in the Czech Republic. And one of the problems that clearly emerged there, I mean, we had applicants who were aggrieved Roma people, but it was clear that for many in the community, they weren't sure that they wanted integration in the schools. They were accustomed to sending their children to segregated schools that were intended for kids with mental disabilities, and so there was a fair amount of awareness raising that had to go on, and that still has to go on, as to why integrated education might be a good thing. And when you're faced with the prospect of a hostile majority population and kids who don't want to sit next to you and parents who don't want you anywhere near their school on the one hand, and the comfortable segregated ghetto school on the other hand, it's easy to understand why Roma families might choose that segregated school. And so part of the work we have to do is working with them to think about what a different and better future might be for their children.
Thank you. I think we may have time for one more question, and then I'll leave enough time for each one of our recipients to perhaps have a 60-second concluding remark. But this is a question from the audience. Could the panel speak to the role of corruption in the executive and the judiciary branch in their respective communities? And it mentions past communist government corruption and any other type of corruption that one might be aware of. And I will give you the. Let me layer that with something else, and just say to you that I know in the United States there have been many studies done on the perception of justice, and the perception varies among different ethnic groups. In fact, whites or Caucasians have the highest level of confidence in the justice system, no matter which study you do. Next, Asian American communities have the next highest confidence in the courts, followed by Latinos, and then African Americans have the lowest degree of confidence. Part of these things are fueled by the perceptions. And I guess it begs the question whether the perception of justice is as important as the reality. And I would put that in there as a filter for you to respond to this question.
Yeah. Well, I can begin with it. I think that it's a really important question because these perceptions are often reflected in realities that are just bewildering to people, and they do feed this doubt, this fear, this concern. I mean, the state of Alabama. We have 9 Supreme Court justices in this state. We have 5 judges on the Court of Criminal Appeals. We have 5 judges on the Court of Appeals. All of them are white. And for people of color, it is problematic that after all of this struggle, there are no people of color on appellate benches. Less than 2% of the trial court judges in the state are black. Less than 1% of the attorneys are black. Yet 67% of the people in jails and prison are African American. And these symbols, these realities, feed this perception that there's a difference that is explained by or shaped by or influenced by things like race. We're taking a case to the U.S. Supreme Court in a couple of months. It's challenging the constitutionality of life without parole for 13-year-old kids. The United States is the only country in the world that imposes life without parole on children as young as 13. All of the 13-year-old kids who've been sentenced to life without parole in America for non-homicides are black. 90% of all the 13-year-olds who've been sentenced for any crime are black. All of the kids under the age of 15 who've been sentenced to life without parole are black. And a lot of it has to do with the way we think about people's value, people's worth, people's dignity. And that's what feeds, in my judgment, these perceptions. You cannot, with our history, avoid those kinds of perceptions, those kinds of responses, until you affirmatively say, we're going to do something about this. And that's why I do think that there is this relationship. I think corruption comes when we fail to recognize what these realities do to public confidence, to the integrity of the society. The death penalty in many communities has that same legacy. We're in a state where there are literally hundreds of people buried in the ground who were lynched, who were accused of something bad and lynched. And we haven't done anything to reconcile ourselves to that history, and it leaves open these concerns. And so I believe we have to be concerned with these perceptions. We have to be concerned with the realities that create those perceptions. And until we make the kind of strong, clear, consistent commitment, and we say the things that suggest and sustain that commitment, these differences are going to undermine our ability to get to a fair and just place. And I think that there is so much that needs to be done to overcome, to challenge, to work on, to respond to these very fundamental differences in the way the system works and for whom it works.
I will very briefly answer because I'm not a lawyer, but more so a human rights defender. But as an observer, obviously what I can say is that corruption is one of the obstacles for of access to justice. And As an example, I would say that throughout the Central and Eastern European countries, the possibility for a defendant to be granted free legal representation, defense is left many times to the discretion of authorities, which obviously, from my standpoint, can be abused on reasons of corruption. And that's why it has been so hard so far to find a uniform rule for providing free legal aid, and it's just Poland that has one, and it's based solely on poverty, whereby the defendant has to prove that he doesn't have sufficient means. But in the rest, it's basically it's so different, and it's so thin, and you never know what you can get, obviously.
I just want to, it's helpful for Bryan to, I think, expand the definition of corruption perhaps beyond what the questioner had meant, which was the notion of money changing hands in order to achieve an outcome. In old Soviet days, we used to speak about telefonная prava, which was a Russian expression meaning telephone justice, in any case that was politically significant. And by definition at that time, any case related to human rights was politically significant. The judge was not the decider of the case. The case was decided by a Communist Party official who would call the judge and tell the judge what the outcome should be. Unfortunately, in some parts of particularly the former Soviet Union, that system still holds. In Eastern Europe, the legacy of that system is still disturbs the quest for justice, even if it's not a routine matter. But what you have, I think, today is a broader, the broader corrupting influences of discrimination and of protection of officials against punishment for crime. So, for example, if you have police officers who are involved in abuse of Roma detainees, which is still unfortunately a frequent occurrence, I think the confidence level that I have in justice systems in the region to mete out justice is quite low, and impunity is still a big issue. We recently had a victory, actually just last week, in a case in Slovakia involving police abuse, and the case took something like 9 years to come to this conclusion and a finding of guilt, at least for some of the police officers involved. So.
Thank you for lending your hearts, your hands, your energies, and your talents to the cause of justice. And today, I want to again thank the Peter and Patricia Gruber Foundation for shining their light on the work of these fabulous people and adding its flame to the flame that's already been ignited by the work that you're doing. We're all better for it. The world is a better place because of the efforts of Robert and Isabela with the ERRC and Bryan Stevenson with the Equal Justice Initiative. And Mr. Stevenson, thank you for this world treasure in Bryan Stevenson. Let me turn it back over to Patricia Gruber, our heroine.
Thank you, Judge Donald. Thank you, Bryan Stevenson. Thank you, Bob Kushen and Isabela Mihalache. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming and joining us today. Please join me in a final salute to our recipients, and this concludes today's ceremony.